Hey, it's Mazzy here, and this is a video on some of the bands that came out of the new wave punk movement out of New York, especially out of the club CBGBs in the Bowery on the East Village in New York. This came out of two different directions, this video. First of all, uh, I just did a video on the upcoming Rhino High Fidelity version of the first television album Marquee Moon, so that kind of inspired me. But the other night I had a discussion with some record friends and people about bands out of New York, and we were trying to figure out. You look at decades and times and places, and you think of the 1960s, for instance, San Francisco, the Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead, and then you go into maybe Steve Miller Band, Quicksilver, Messenger Service, Country Joe and the Fish from the Bay Area there, and others, obviously. You go to LA and there's the Birds and there's Love and there's the Doors, of course, and many other bands too. The whole Laurel Canyon scene going on there. Of course, San Francisco is the Haight-Ashbury. And again, not that every band lived and worked in a certain neighborhood or area, but they seem to grow out of a certain place. And we were asking about and thinking about and pondering New York 60s. We couldn't think of anyone except for the Velvet Underground. Now, of course, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, but they didn't have the same social impact, and maybe that's what I'm thinking about. Of course, their second album was huge, but it wasn't the same kind of neighborhood scene in New York. Now, a few years earlier, the whole folk scene, the folk revival in the early 60s, obviously, with Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and the whole Eric Von Schmidt, the whole New York scene, Tom Paxton and Phil Oakes and Greenwich Village and MacDougal Street and many more, Odetta, many more beyond what I'm mentioning here. That was a central thing out of New York. Now, folk music was beyond New York City. Obviously, you had the folk revival in the UK as well. But a lot of times a city is identified musically and vice versa with bands and artists. And really, when it came down to it, I think what we were thinking of, the bands that people remember, or the time, that identity is in rock and roll, not folk music, more than the 60s in New York, was really the late 70s with the Lower East Side, the punk scene, CBGBs, East Village, and some of these artists. Of course, that merged with the art scene, spilled into the 80s with the no wave situation and all the artists that came about around that time. So I wanted to go through just some albums, not deep dive, that I have from that time period. Now, my first visit to New York City was in 1978. I didn't see any concerts on that. My girlfriend, who was from the East Coast, I was on my way to Europe, my first European trip, and we stopped in New York and hung out in New York and Connecticut and went all over Manhattan, the sights. But ironically, considering we were so into music, we didn't see any music on that trip. And I wouldn't go to CBGBs well into the late 80s. And I've only been there, I think, twice. And the first artist I saw, it's got to be 86 or 87, was Sonic Youth, that period of them after their initial, I think they played at CBGBs in 81. But I want to show some records I have in my collection. Now, I don't have everything, and I'm not showing everything by all these artists, maybe two or three at the most of the albums I have. And there's a handful of artists that I am missing. And of course, the one that's probably the most famous and notable of the early punk scene is the Ramones. This is their debut on Sire Records. And then this is Road to Russia. I got promo copies of these. Now, my introduction to Ramones was really interesting because when this album came out, I was managing this record store, and we had, I think, 7 stores in the Bay Area, and all the 7 managers were flown down to LA to pull records for our stores at this one stop, which is a distributor. There were distributors in the Bay Area, primarily in the East Bay, also some on the San Francisco Peninsula. But there's certain records we didn't have. So the owner flew us down for the day. We went at lunch. They picked us up in this stretch limo. It was a little bit of debauchery, but we hung out at this kind of, I don't even remember the neighborhood or the name of the distributor, but an industrial area of Southern California around LA. And in walks these guys, and they did like an in distribution thing promoting them. And we had just heard about this album. I don't even know if I had heard it yet. Looking back on it, I can't believe why none of us got this record signed by them. But they were standing around for about an hour looking at records, pulling records for themselves. And I don't even remember exactly what I said, if I said anything, but I was with a group of other people. There maybe were 20 people at the most in this distribution warehouse. And no, the Ramones were there. So Road to Russia, this was a promo copy we got from the label from Warner Brothers, Sire Records. And it says, provided with the hope that you will play this in store, not for resale. The Warner Brothers Records and Tapes. Ramones, Rocket to Russia. And then just one more, a promo copy that I got back then is obviously Road to Ruin. So, I mean, very influential band. I mean, I remember at the time thinking, you know, that was early punk for us, I guess. It was just like, I guess we called it punk, but I just remember it being like fast surf music. That's how I pictured it. Another band, one of the guys that worked for me, that worked in the store that I worked in, one of my record store guys that I hired, spent some time in New York and would go to clubs, and he all of a sudden told us about this artist, and this is Patti Smith. So he was more familiar. It's nice having someone in the store in different genres that turn you on to different music. And he was the guy that really was turning us on to the whole East Coast punk scene, the CBGBs punk scene. Of course, Patti Smith was, you know, a very start of it. Of course, punk poet, a friend and a partner for a little while, but really a close friend of the photographer Robert Mapplethorpe, who photographed this beautiful cover. And this is her first album on Arista Records. And when you think about it, it's pretty amazing that Clive Davis, who started Arista, came from Columbia Records, was actually a lawyer, not a music guy originally, really went for artists like this. And you got to admire Clive Davis for going someone as edgy as this at the time in 1976. 75, actually, this album came out. So this was early also, but from that whole CBGBs scene. Just a great debut produced by John Cale there. And then there's Radio Ethiopia. And this is the first Patti Smith and group. This is the first album she put out, not with her name only, but as the group, of course. And this was produced by Jack Douglas, who also would go on to produce Double Fantasy and produce Cheap Trick and many others out of New York. But what a great record this is. The only other one I'm going to show is this one, Easter. This is the third album. This is under the Patti Smith group as well. And what a fantastic album. She's never made a bad album. Because the Night. Now, this was unusual in a way because this was a Bruce Springsteen song that Bruce hadn't recorded yet officially, aside from some live shows later on. This was a huge, massive hit and pushed someone you wouldn't consider to be someone to cross over on AM charts to have a hit record. And Because the Night on Easter by Patti Smith. This is Television with Richard Lloyd and Tom Verlaine. This was another cover photographed by Robert Mapplethorpe with some edgy tonal post-production added to it. I think is a great photograph. I kind of like his stark black and white work. I don't know if this was necessary, but we like it. We have it now. Marquee Moon, great dueling guitars. Watch that video. I get a little deeper into it. And of course, her second album on Elektra, and this is Adventure. It's more polished, but I think it's as good as the first album. It probably is a slightly better production sounding record than the debut, but they're both just important records. The first one, Marquee Moon, usually gets all the love. This one, not as much, but I think this is amazing. The guitar riffs on Glory and Foxhole. I mean, this whole album is a gem. Television, and he was also tight with Patti Smith, and they were like very close. And then one of the bands that really crossed over to the big time a year or two later is Blondie. This is their debut album. What a great record. They had a little bit of a retro sound, a little bit of a girls group. Of course, Debbie Harry and Chris Stein led them off. What a fantastic band at the time here. Clement Burke on drums. Great band, great. I remember the guy that worked with us who was turning us on to all these would literally one day walk to the B section. We just got this and said, we got to pop this open. You got to hear this. He was so in tune what was happening in New York out of the CBGB scene. And and it was great. I love this record. And then, of course, this is Blondie Plastic Letters. Again, they had hits on here. They did a cover of Denis, the French song, their version going from English to French. But she had this just great pop pinup, ingenue French New York mix that really attracted everything. But the band was great. It wasn't just Debbie Harry. It was a great friggin' band. And let's start with this. 77, the debut on Sire Records. That was great about Seymour Stein of Sire Records. He really hung around CBGBs and chased after these artists playing, and was a really someone who was in tune and open to all different areas of music. And the Talking Heads, obviously, you know this band. I don't have to say them anymore, but this got a lot of airplay on the more the college stations at first because of Psycho Killer, Qu'est-ce que c'est? And I did see them at the boarding house on that very first tour. A fantastic band and very different. And of course, the other two right after that, obviously, are more songs about building and food, and then Fear of Music, with great artistic covers. And not only do you have David Byrne, that lead singer, and that interesting persona that led the group, that's the voice of the group. You had a great band here. You had Chris Franz on drums. You had Tina Weymouth on bass, and of course they would later do a couple projects of the Tom Tom Club. Got Jerry Harrison, who played with the Roadrunners, with Jonathan Richmond for a while. But the Talking Heads, another important band coming out of the whole CBGBs scene in the late 70s. Another one that didn't really break out a lot. He became more of a cult artist, but important nonetheless, and that is Richard Hell and the Voidoids. Now, he originally played bass with Television, and then before they recorded their first album, he would go on and start his own band. This is a really good record, punk record. He's written a lot of books, so I think he turned into more to the literary world, poetic world after band. And I never really followed him much after this, unfortunately. But an important band of the time. This was originally on Sire Records, also in 1977, coming out. A band that came out of San Francisco originally, somewhat, and then moved to New York. And this is a little different. This is produced by Jack Nietzsche, who had worked with Neil Young and a composer and arranger in his own right. This is Mink DeVille. Willie DeVille is his stage name. Mick DeVille, this is their debut on Capitol Records. This is a different kind of record. This is a soulful throwback. There's a certain soulness of Latin side to it that is a wonderful record. This got some FM radio play when it came out. This came out also in 1977. Opens up with Venus of Avenue D, original. But there's sort of retro of the early 60s sound, songs like Little Girl. The song that got some airplay, at least on the West Coast here, and probably, I assume, on the East Coast, is Mixed Up, Shook Up Girl, an original by Willie DeVille. That's a really good, almost like a Latin soulful rock tune, very much going back to like the style of soul music of Benny King, that type of music. And so this was a little different. That's a nice thing out of these bands from the CBGB scene, as any of the punk bands. There's different fragments of sub kind of directions they took. And what a great, great record this is. Cadillac Walk, a song by John Martin, was also another great song on here. Not the John Martin folk singer out of the UK, but what a great song that is. Very soulful, wonderful recorded song. Then there's the band that I didn't get into right away. However, I saw them, I think, more into the 80s. And this was out of New York. This is the East Coast, the Cramps. They would probably be one of the originators of what we now call psychobilly. It's sort of a rockabilly merging with punk. This is a comp that came out, probably the most famous of their album covers. These are actually two reissues from about 7-8 years ago, cut by Kevin Gray, if you can believe that, and they sound great. I mean, these are actually pretty well recorded records, self-produced by the Cramps, psychobilly, psychopunk, another band that really kind of got their start in New York at CBGBs. And lastly, I'm going to close out with a band that's not even a band, American band, but I think they played one of their American shows, first American shows at CBGBs. Was it on a double bill with Television? Not sure who they played with, but I did see them when they came to San Francisco and played the Mabuhay Gardens. And that's, of course, the debut by the British band, The Damned. Great punk band. It seems so tame now compared to when I heard it when it first came out. Produced by Nick Lowe. This is my original UK stiff copy put out by Island Records back in 1977 or 78. But The Damned. And that's it. So that is my, my little overview on some bands out of CBGBs. A club started in 1973 by Hilly Crystal, I should mention that, in the Bowery. It closed in 2006 and now is a kind of a high-end clothing, eyeglasses, dapper store. I think there's a few little reminiscence of CBGBs there, but it's a shell of what it was. Again, I only saw Sonic Youth there in the 80s. It obviously morphed more later into more of a hardcore punk venue, and really morphed like any club. They kind of merge depending on the times and places. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Mazzy loves you.